They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you about what happens when greed runs thicker than both. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves you, it's what they teach you to fight for. 3 months ago, I was standing in a courthouse lobby watching my stepmother's face drain of color as her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear. The papers in my hand felt like they weighed nothing, but they carried the weight of justice itself. Victoria Blackwood, the woman who'd tried to steal my father's legacy, was about to learn that some battles aren't won by those who strike first, but by those who strike smart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story begins 2 years earlier, in a place that once felt like home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog was just beginning to lift from Lake Clearwater as I pulled into the gravel driveway of my childhood home. The old Victorian house stood exactly as I remembered it, white clapboard siding that needed a fresh coat of paint, wrap-around porch where Dad used to read his morning paper, and those distinctive forest green shutters that Mom had insisted on before she passed when I was 12. I was 24 then, fresh out of grad school with a master's degree in environmental science and about as naive as they come. I'd spent the last 6 years buried in textbooks and research papers, living in a tiny apartment near campus, visiting home only for holidays and summer breaks. Real life, the kind with mortgages and medical bills and family drama, felt like something that happened to other people. Dad had called me 3 weeks earlier, his voice carrying that familiar mix of pride and exhaustion that had defined him since Mom's death. "Sarah, honey, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come home for a weekend?" Thomas Mitchell had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. At 58, he was still the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands, a general contractor who'd built half the custom homes in Millbrook County. His crew respected him, his clients trusted him, and after Mom died, he'd thrown himself into his work with the dedication of a man trying to outrun grief. "What's going on, Dad?" I ask, already mentally rearranging my weekend plans. "Just come home, sweetheart. We'll talk then." Now, standing on that familiar porch, I could hear voices inside, Dad's low rumble and a woman's laugh I didn't recognize. I knocked, and the voices stopped. Dad opened the door, and for a moment I was struck by how much older he looked. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his thick brown hair was more gray than I remembered. But his smile was the same, warm and genuine, the kind that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. "There's my girl," he said, pulling me into one of his bear hugs that smelled like sawdust and Old Spice. "Perfect timing. I want you to meet someone." The woman who appeared beside him was nothing like my mother. Where Mom had been soft and nurturing, this woman was all sharp angles and careful makeup. She was maybe 45, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon and wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Sarah, this is Victoria Blackwood," Dad said, his arm around the woman's waist. "Victoria, meet my daughter Sarah." She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile bright but somehow not reaching her eyes. "Sarah, your father talks about you constantly. I feel like I know you already." I shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the way she held eye contact just a beat too long. "Nice to meet you, Victoria. Dad didn't mention he was seeing anyone." "Well, we wanted to tell you in person," Dad said, and I caught something in his voice. Nervousness? Guilt? "Victoria and I have been dating for about 8 months now." 8 months. While I'd been finishing my thesis on watershed management, Dad had been building a whole new relationship. The realization hit me with unexpected force. I'd been so focused on my own life, my own future, that I somehow missed my father moving on from my mother. We settled in the living room, the same room where Mom used to help me with homework, where we opened Christmas presents, where Dad told me she wasn't coming home from the hospital.
Victoria perched on the sofa like she was posing for a magazine, while Dad fidgeted with his coffee mug. "So, Victoria," I said, trying to fill the awkward silence, "what do you do?" She said that she was in real estate, and something about the way she said it made it sound more glamorous than it probably was. High-end properties, mostly lake houses, estates, that sort of thing. I actually specialize in helping families maximize the value of inherited properties. The phrase stuck with me, though I couldn't say why at the time. "That's interesting," I said. "Have you lived in Millbrook long?" "About 2 years now. I moved here from Chicago after my divorce was finalized." She reached over and squeezed Dad's hand. "Best decision I ever made." Dad's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since Mom got sick. Despite my reservations, I found myself genuinely happy for him. He'd been alone for 12 years, throwing himself into work and raising me. If this woman made him smile like that, maybe she wasn't so bad. "Actually, Sarah," Dad said, "there's something else we wanted to tell you. Victoria and well, we're getting married."
The words hit me like a physical blow. Married. My father, who still kept Mom's picture on his nightstand, who wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, was getting married to a woman I'd known for all of 20 minutes. "When?" I managed to ask. "Next month," Victoria said, her voice bright with excitement. "Just a small ceremony at the courthouse. Nothing fancy." Next month. I looked at Dad, searching his face for some sign that this was all moving too fast, that he needed more time to think. But all I saw was contentment and maybe something that looked like relief. Wow, I said, forcing a smile. "Congratulations. I mean, this is a lot to process, but if you're happy, Dad, then I'm happy for you." Dad's shoulders relaxed, and I realized he'd been worried about my reaction. "You mean everything to me, Sarah. Your opinion matters more than anyone else's. I know this might seem sudden, but Victoria makes me feel alive again. For the first time since your mother died, I can imagine a future." The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of wedding planning discussions and getting to know you conversations. Victoria was charming and attentive, asking about my career plans and complimenting Mom's garden, which Dad had somehow kept alive all these years. She seemed genuinely interested in our family history, asking detailed questions about the house, about Dad's business, about our traditions. "Your father tells me this house has been in your family for 3 generations, she said as we walked through the garden on Sunday morning. 4, actually, I corrected. My great-great-grandfather built it in 1892. He was one of the original settlers in Millbrook County." "How wonderful! Such history. And it's all been kept so authentic." She ran her hand along the porch railing. "Properties like this are incredibly valuable, you know, the historical significance alone." Something in her tone made me glance at her sharply, but her expression was merely appreciative. "Dad would never sell. This place means everything to him, to us." "Of course not," Victoria said quickly. "I can see why. It's clearly a family treasure." That Sunday evening, as I prepared to drive back to my apartment, Dad walked me to my car. The sun was setting behind the lake, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The same light I remembered from 1,000 childhood evenings. "Are you really okay with this, sweetheart?" he asked, leaning against my car door. I studied his face in the fading light. He looked happier than I had seen him in years, but also vulnerable in a way that made my chest tight. "Dad, I want you to be happy. If Victoria makes you happy, then I support this. I guess I wish I had more time to get used to the idea." He nodded, understanding. "I know it's fast, but at my age, you don't waste time when you find something good. Life's too short, and I've already lost too many years to grief." "Just promise me you'll be careful," I said, not entirely sure what I meant by that. "Careful how?" "I don't know. It's just, make sure you really know her, you know? Mom always said you were too trusting for your own good." Dad chuckled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Your mother also said I was the luckiest man alive because I had both of you. Maybe Victoria's just my luck coming back around." As I drove away that night, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The place that had always been my anchor, my constant in a world of change, suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I told myself I was being selfish, that Dad deserved happiness, that Victoria seemed nice enough despite my reservations. What I didn't know then was that some instincts exist for a reason, and that the feeling of unease settling in my stomach would prove to be more prophetic than I could have possibly imagined. The wedding was exactly as Victoria had promised, small and simple. I stood as Dad's witness, wearing the dress Mom had bought me for graduation, trying to focus on his joy rather than the strange emptiness I felt watching him promise his life to a woman who was still essentially a stranger to me. But that was just the beginning, because sometimes the real story doesn't start with the wedding. It starts with what comes after, when the masks begin to slip and you discover that not everyone who smiles has your best interests at heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 months after the wedding, I got the call that changed everything. I was in the middle of presenting my environmental impact assessment to the Portland Parks Department when my phone buzzed with Dad's ringtone. I ignored it. Thomas Mitchell had raised me to be professional, and interrupting a presentation wasn't something either of us would approve of. But when it rang again immediately, then a third time, I knew something was wrong. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," I told the conference room full of city officials, stepping into the hallway with my heart already racing. "Sarah?" Dad's voice was weak, unfamiliar. "Honey, I'm at Millbrook General. I need you to come home." The next 4 hours were a blur of canceled meetings, frantic packing, and the longest drive of my life. I called the hospital twice from the road, but the nurses would only tell me he was stable and asking for me. Victoria didn't answer her phone. I found Dad in room 314, looking impossibly small against the white hospital sheets. His face was gray, and there were wires and tubes connecting him to machines that beeped steadily in the quiet room. He was awake, though, and when he saw me, he managed a weak version of his familiar smile. "There's my girl," he whispered as I grabbed his hand. "What happened, Dad?" I asked, pulling a chair close to his bed. "Heart attack," he said simply. "Woke up this morning feeling like an elephant was sitting on my chest. Victoria drove me here." "Where is Victoria now?" Something flickered across his face. Disappointment? Hurt? "She had to go handle some business. Said she'd be back later." Business. While her husband of 6 months was lying in a cardiac care unit, Victoria was handling business? I bit back my first response and focused on Dad. "What did the doctor say?" "That I need surgery, triple bypass." His voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Dr. Peterson wants to do it tomorrow morning." Dr. Peterson turned out to be a serious woman in her 50s who didn't believe in sugarcoating bad news, she explained when I found her at the nurse's station. "Your father's had what we call a widowmaker heart attack. The main artery to his heart was 90% blocked. He's lucky to be alive." "And the surgery?" "Necessary, but risky given the extent of the damage. I won't lie to you, there are no guarantees with something this severe." That night, I stayed in Dad's room, dozing fitfully in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Victoria appeared around midnight, breezing in like she'd just come from a dinner party rather than spending the day away from her hospitalized husband. "Sarah, I didn't expect you so soon," she said, her voice pitched low for the hospital setting. "How is he?" "Scared," I said, not bothering to hide my irritation. "Where have you been all day?" "Oh, you know, just trying to keep everything together. Your father's crew needed direction on the Morrison project, and I had to cancel appointments." She trailed off, apparently realizing how callous she sounded. "I mean, someone had to handle the practical things." Dad stirred at the sound of our voices, and Victoria immediately switched to caring wife mode, fussing over his blankets and asking how he felt. But I noticed she didn't hold his hand the way I did, didn't seem to understand that he needed touch more than commentary.
The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. At 6:45, as they wheeled Dad toward the operating room, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. About the house, about my will." "Dad, don't. You're going to be fine. We'll talk about everything after the surgery." "But if something happens?" "Nothing's going to happen." He squeezed my hand harder. "Promise me you'll take care of the house. Promise me you won't let anyone sell it." The specificity of his request struck me as odd, but before I could ask what he meant, the orderly was wheeling him away, and Victoria was saying something about getting coffee. The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours of pacing hospital corridors, drinking terrible coffee, and watching Victoria check her phone constantly. She made several calls, always stepping outside to take them, always returning with some excuse about urgent matters that couldn't wait.
At 2:30 p.m., Dr. Peterson emerged from the operating room, looking exhausted but relieved. "The surgery went well," she said. "We were able to do the bypass, and his heart responded better than expected. He's going to need significant recovery time, but I'm cautiously optimistic." Victoria burst into tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all day. For a moment, I felt guilty for my suspicions. Maybe she really did love him. Maybe she was just one of those people who handled stress by staying busy. Dad spent the next 3 weeks in the hospital, then came home to face months of cardiac rehabilitation. I took a leave of absence from my job, something I could barely afford, to help with his recovery. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed to disappear more frequently, always with explanations about keeping the business running or handling Dad's affairs. It was during the second week of Dad's home recovery that I started noticing things. Small things at first. Victoria asking detailed questions about Dad's insurance policies, her spending long hours on the phone with people she identified as business associates, but whose conversations I could never quite catch. The way she'd grown impatient with Dad's slow recovery, making comments about how long it was taking him to get back to normal. Then there were the visitors. Men in expensive suits who came to the house ostensibly to check on Dad, but spent most of their time talking quietly with Victoria on the front porch. When I asked Dad who they were, he seemed genuinely confused. "I don't know any of those guys. Victoria said they were from the insurance company, but I've had the same agent for 20 years, and none of them were him." The biggest red flag came 3 weeks into his recovery. I was in the kitchen making Dad's lunch when I overheard Victoria on the phone in the study, the same study where Dad kept all his important papers. "I understand the timeline, but he's recovering slower than expected. No, I can't just ask him to sign papers right now. He's barely able to focus for more than an hour at a time. Yes, I know what we agreed, but if we push too hard too fast, it's going to look suspicious." I froze, straining to hear more, but she'd lowered her voice. When she emerged from the study 10 minutes later, she looked startled to find me in the kitchen. "How's your father feeling?" she asked, her tone overly bright. "Better every day," I lied, studying her face. "Victoria, who was that on the phone?" "Oh, just someone from my office. We're trying to close a difficult sale." She moved toward the refrigerator, but I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "You know how it is in real estate. Timing is everything." That night, after Dad had gone to bed early, as he did every evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I waited until Victoria went for her nightly bath, then slipped into Dad's study. The room felt different somehow, less organized than usual. Dad was meticulous about his filing system, but several drawers were slightly ajar, and papers were stacked differently than I remembered. I was looking through his desk when I found something that made my blood run cold.
It was a real estate appraisal for our house, dated just 2 weeks ago. The assessment valued the property at $1.2 million, far more than I'd ever imagined. Attached to the appraisal was a note in Victoria's handwriting. Confirmed with county assessor, no liens, clear title, ready for quick sale if needed. Ready for quick sale. The phrase echoed in my mind as I photographed the documents with my phone, my hands shaking with adrenaline and growing suspicion. But it was what I found next that confirmed my worst fears. Buried in a stack of medical bills was a draft of a new will, one I'd never seen before. According to the document, Dad was leaving everything to Victoria, with only a small trust fund designated for me. The house, his business, his life insurance, everything would go to the woman he'd known for barely over a year. At the bottom of the draft, in Dad's shaky handwriting, was a note. Victoria says this is standard for married couples. Need to think about this more. I sat in Dad's chair, staring at the papers before me, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. This wasn't about love or companionship. Victoria hadn't fallen for my father, she had targeted him. A widowed contractor with a valuable property and no close family except for a daughter who lived 3 hours away. He must have seemed like the perfect mark. The worst part was understanding just how vulnerable Dad was. He'd been lonely for so long, so grateful for companionship, that he was blind to the signs I was only now beginning to recognize. The way Victoria had pushed for a quick wedding, her detailed questions about our family history and the house's value, her sudden presence in his life right around the time he'd started talking about updating his will. I carefully returned everything to its original position and went to my childhood bedroom, my mind racing. I needed proof, real evidence of whatever scheme Victoria was running. More importantly, I needed to protect Dad without destroying him in the process. If he discovered that the woman he'd married had targeted him for his assets, it might finish what the heart attack had started. That night, lying in my old twin bed under the same glow-in-the-dark stars I'd put on the ceiling when I was 10, I made a decision. I was going to investigate Victoria Blackwood, and I was going to find out exactly what she was planning. What I didn't know was that Victoria was already 3 steps ahead of me, and that the game she was playing had stakes higher than I could possibly imagine. The woman sleeping down the hall wasn't just after Dad's house. She was orchestrating something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The catalyst had been Dad's heart attack, but the real story was just beginning. And as I would soon discover, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who smile while they circle their prey.
The next morning, I woke up with a plan that felt both necessary and impossible. I needed to investigate Victoria without alerting her to my suspicions, protect Dad without breaking his heart, and somehow gather evidence of whatever scheme she was running, all while pretending to be the grateful stepdaughter who was just happy her father had found love again. I started with the basics. While Victoria was out on what she called property showings, and Dad was napping after his morning medications, I did what any millennial would do. I stalked her online. Victoria Blackwood's digital footprint was surprisingly thin for someone who claimed to be a successful real estate agent. Her LinkedIn profile showed she'd worked for Prestige Properties in Chicago until 2 years ago, then moved to Millbrook to join Lakeshore Realty. But when I called Prestige Properties pretending to be a potential client asking for a referral, they had no record of anyone named Victoria Blackwood ever working there. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "She would have left about 2 years ago, specialized in high-end properties." "I'm sorry, miss, but I've been the office manager here for 8 years. I know every agent who's worked for this company, and that name doesn't ring a bell." I hung up feeling sick. Victoria had lied about her background. But lying on a resume wasn't necessarily criminal. Maybe she'd just been embellishing to impress Dad.
I needed more. Lakeshore Realty proved more cooperative, but what I learned there was even more troubling. Victoria had joined the agency 18 months ago with impressive credentials from Chicago. She'd been their top seller for 6 months running, specializing in what their receptionist called estate liquidations. She has a real gift for helping families through difficult transitions, the young woman explained. You know, when someone passes away or needs to move to assisted living quickly, she understands how to maximize value in time-sensitive situations. Estate liquidations. Time-sensitive situations. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. I spent the afternoon at the Millbrook County Courthouse, learning to navigate property records and marriage certificates. What I found made my hands shake as I photographed the documents with my phone. Victoria Blackwood had been married before, not once, but 3 times. Each marriage had lasted less than 2 years. Each husband had been older, widowed, and owned significant property, and in each case, Victoria had walked away from the divorce with a substantial settlement. The most disturbing case was her second husband, Robert Chen, a 62-year-old retired engineer from Phoenix. According to court records, he died just 8 months after their wedding, a sudden heart attack very similar to Dad's. Victoria inherited his house, his retirement accounts, and his life insurance policy, worth over $2 million combined. But it was the third case that made me understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. Harold Morrison, age 59, had married Victoria in Las Vegas 3 years ago. 6 months later, he'd signed over power of attorney to her due to what court documents described as rapidly declining cognitive function. Victoria had sold his house, liquidated his assets, and placed him in a nursing home before disappearing with everything he'd owned. Morrison was still alive, still in that nursing home, and according to the most recent court filing, his children were trying to have Victoria prosecuted for elder abuse and fraud. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at the evidence spread across my passenger seat, feeling like I was going to throw up. This wasn't opportunistic gold digging. This was a pattern, a systematic targeting of vulnerable older men with assets to steal. And my father was her latest victim. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I go to the police? But what crime had she actually committed yet? Should I confront her directly? But that would only put Dad in danger and give her time to cover her tracks. Should I tell Dad everything? But the shock might literally kill him. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd made a decision. I was going to gather irrefutable evidence of Victoria's scheme, document everything carefully, and then present it all to Dad and the authorities at once. But I had to be smart about it. Victoria had been running this con for years. She wasn't going to be easy to catch. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table like a normal family, I watched Victoria with new eyes. She was performing perfectly, asking Dad about his physical therapy, praising the meal I'd cooked, and discussing plans for remodeling the guest bathroom. But now I could see the calculation behind every gesture, the way she steered conversations toward topics like Dad's insurance policies and retirement accounts. "Tom, honey," she said, cutting her chicken with precise movements, "I was talking to my financial advisor today about estate planning. He said it's really important for married couples to make sure all their accounts are set up with proper beneficiaries. Have you updated yours since we got married?" Dad looked uncomfortable. "Well, I figured we'd talk about that when I'm feeling stronger. It's not exactly urgent." "Of course not," Victoria said quickly, reaching over to pat his hand. "I just want to make sure you're protected. And Sarah, too, naturally. We're a family now." The way she said "naturally" made my skin crawl. I forced myself to smile and nod, playing the role of the trusting daughter, while internally cataloging every word. After dinner, I volunteered to do the dishes while Victoria helped Dad with his evening medications.
I was loading the dishwasher when I heard her voice from the living room, pitched low but audible through the thin walls of the old house. I know it's hard to think about these things, but what if something had happened during your surgery? Sarah would have been left trying to figure out your affairs with no legal authority to act. It would have been a nightmare for her. I suppose you're right, Dad said slowly. It's just changing my will feels like I'm expecting something bad to happen. Not expecting, honey, just being responsible. Think of it as taking care of the people you love. I gripped the edge of the counter, forcing myself to breathe steadily. She was good, really good. She was using Dad's love for me as leverage to convince him to sign over his assets to her. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt increasingly surreal. During the day, I played the devoted daughter, helping with Dad's recovery and making pleasant conversation with Victoria. But at night, after they went to bed, I became a detective. I installed a small recording app on my phone and started documenting Victoria's conversations. I photographed every document I could find in Dad's study. I researched her previous victims more thoroughly, building a timeline of her movements over the past 5 years. What emerged was the profile of a sophisticated predator. Victoria wasn't just stealing from these men, she was systematically destroying their lives. She would isolate them from family and friends, convince them to make her their power of attorney, then liquidate their assets while they were too sick or confused to stop her. The pattern was always the same. She'd target widowed men with valuable property and few close relatives. She'd romance them quickly, push for marriage, then create situations where they became financially dependent on her. In Robert Shen's case, she'd convinced him to refinance his house and invest the money in a guaranteed scheme that had turned out to be fraudulent, a scheme she'd likely set up herself. Harold Morrison had been convinced to undergo an experimental treatment for early-stage dementia, a treatment that had mysteriously accelerated his cognitive decline. But it was the phone calls that provided the most damning evidence. Every night, around 11 p.m., Victoria would step onto the back porch to take a call. From my bedroom window, I could hear fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. He's still too suspicious about the will changes. Might need to move faster than we planned. The daughter is becoming a problem. That last comment hit me like a physical blow. Victoria knew I was onto her, which meant Dad was in more immediate danger than I'd realized. I was running out of time, and I was running up against obstacles I hadn't anticipated. The biggest problem wasn't just proving Victoria's guilt, it was figuring out how to protect Dad without destroying him in the process. Because here's what I hadn't expected. Despite everything I'd discovered, Dad was genuinely happy with Victoria. For the first time since Mom's death, he was talking about the future with excitement. He was making plans, setting goals, looking forward to traveling with Victoria once he'd recovered. How do you tell someone you love that their happiness is built on a lie? How do you destroy the relationship that's given them hope without destroying them along with it? The answer came to me on a Thursday night, as I lay awake listening to Victoria's muffled voice on the porch below. I couldn't just expose her and hope for the best. I needed to turn the tables, to make her reveal herself in a way that would protect Dad from the worst of the betrayal. I needed to make Victoria Blackwood think she was winning, right up until the moment I destroyed her completely. But first, I had to survive whatever she was planning for me. Because if Victoria saw me as a problem, I have no doubt she'd try to solve me the same way she solved the other obstacles in her previous cons. The resistance phase of my journey wasn't just about overcoming my fear of confronting Victoria. It was about overcoming the terrible knowledge that sometimes the people we love most are the ones we have to save for themselves.
The decision to act came at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday morning when I caught Victoria trying to access Dad's computer. I'd been having trouble sleeping, my mind constantly racing through scenarios and evidence, so I'd gotten up for some water. As I padded quietly down the hallway in my bare feet, I noticed light coming from under Dad's study door, the soft blue glow of a computer screen. Victoria was sitting at Dad's desk, her face illuminated by the monitor as she typed rapidly. She was so focused that she didn't hear me approach. From the doorway, I could see she had multiple browser windows open, Dad's bank account, his investment portfolio, and what looked like some kind of document preparation software. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to use it. I managed to record nearly 30 seconds of footage before the old house betrayed me with a creaking floorboard. Victoria spun around, her fists cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally, settling on practiced innocence. "Sarah, you startled me. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd help your father organize his files. You know how men are with paperwork." But I'd seen what was on the screen. She'd been in the process of creating new beneficiary forms for Dad's retirement accounts, listing herself as the primary beneficiary with 100% allocation. "It's pretty late for paperwork," I said, keeping my voice level despite my heart hammering against my ribs. "Well, you know how it is when you can't sleep. Might as well be productive." She stood and moved away from the computer, but not before I saw her close several windows. "How's your father sleeping? I worry about him overexerting himself." "He's fine," I said. "Victoria, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." "Why didn't you tell us about your previous marriages?" The question hung in the air between us. Victoria's composure didn't crack, but something shifted behind her eyes. A calculation, a reassessment of threat levels. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "I mean your 3 previous husbands, Robert Chen, Harold Morrison, James Walsh. I found the public records, Victoria. I know about the pattern." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Victoria left, a sound so genuine and relieved that I almost doubted what I'd discovered. "Oh, Sarah, I should have known you'd be thorough. You're your father's daughter." She sank into one of the leather chairs facing Dad's desk. "I was hoping to avoid this conversation, at least until your father was stronger." "What conversation?" "The one where I have to explain why a woman my age has been married and divorced 3 times. It's not exactly the kind of thing you lead with when you're trying to build a new relationship." I stared at her, thrown by her apparent candor. "What about Robert Chen? He died, Victoria, 8 months after you married him." "Yes, he did. Robert had a massive coronary while we were on our honeymoon in Maui. Most traumatic experience of my life. I was 28 years old, married for 8 months, and suddenly I'm a widow dealing with estates and lawyers and insurance companies." "And Harold Morrison?" "Harold was already showing signs of dementia when we met. His children were in denial about it, but I could see the progression. I tried to take care of him, Sarah, but it became impossible. The doctors said residential care was the only option. His children blamed me for my father's condition. They needed someone to be angry at, and I was the convenient target." It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't spent the last week researching her background, I might have believed her. But I'd seen the court documents. I knew about the suspicious timing, the financial transfers, the power of attorney arrangements. "What about James Walsh?" Pressed. Victoria hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "James was a mistake. I was young and naive, and I trusted the wrong person. The marriage lasted 6 months before I realized he was only interested in my inheritance from Robert." Every answer was plausible. Every explanation had just enough truth mixed in to be believable. But I'd caught her in Dad's computer at 2 a.m. creating beneficiary forms without his knowledge. "I have proof, Victoria," I said quietly. "I have recordings of your phone calls. I know about the financial planning you're doing without Dad's input. I know about the quick sale preparation for the house." This time, her mask slipped. For just an instant, I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features before the concerned stepmother expression returned. "Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding." "No, I'm not." I pulled out my phone and played back 30 seconds of the recording I'd just made. Victoria's voice filled the quiet study. "Thought I'd help your father organize his files. But the audio also captured what she was doing on the computer, the soft clicking of keys, the distinctive sound of the printer starting up. Victoria had printed something before I interrupted her. "What did you print?" "And nothing important." I moved to the printer and found 3 pages sitting in the output tray. Beneficiary change forms for Dad's 3 largest retirement accounts, already filled out with Victoria's information, just waiting for Dad's signature.
Nothing important? I held up the papers. These forms would transfer over $400,000 to you, without Dad's knowledge. Victoria stood slowly, and for the first time since I'd met her, she dropped the act entirely. The concerned wife expression evaporated, replaced by something sharp and appraising. "You're more clever than I gave you credit for," she said. "Your father said you were smart, but I assumed he meant book smart, academic smart. What's your real plan, Victoria?" "My real plan?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My real plan is to be financially secure for the first time in my life. Your father is a sweet man, Sarah, but he's also a means to an end." The casual cruelty of this statement hit me like a slap. "He loves you." "I know. It makes everything so much easier." Victoria moved closer, and I realized how isolated we were. Dad was upstairs, heavily medicated and deep in sleep. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. "The question now is what we're going to do about your inconvenient curiosity." I could scream, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I could wake up Dad right now and show him everything. "You could," Victoria agreed, "but that would kill him, wouldn't it? The shock of learning that his new wife, the woman he's been so happy with, is actually a con artist who's been planning to rob him blind. Given his recent cardiac event, the stress might literally stop his heart." She was right, and we both knew it. Dad's cardiologist had been very clear about avoiding emotional trauma during his recovery period. "So what do you want?" I asked. "I want you to go back to Portland," Victoria said. "I want you to resume your life and stop interfering with mine. Your father will recover fully. I have no intention of hurting him physically, but he will gradually become more financially dependent on me, and when the time is right, he'll make the necessary legal arrangements to ensure my security." "And if I refuse?" Victoria's smile was all teeth. "Then your father has an unfortunate accident. Maybe he falls down the stairs. Maybe he forgets to take his medication properly. Maybe he has another heart attack from the stress of learning about his daughter's drug problem." "My what?" "The drug problem you're going to develop if you don't cooperate. I have connections, Sarah. It would be very easy to plant evidence in your car, your apartment, your workplace. Suddenly, you're an unreliable witness with a substance abuse problem. Who's going to believe anything you say about me then?" I stared at her, understanding for the first time the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic operation run by someone who'd thought through every angle, every contingency. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She underestimated what I was willing to risk to protect my father. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to shake slightly. "Okay, you win. I'll go back to Portland. I'll stop investigating. Just don't hurt him." Victoria's tension visibly relaxed. "You're making the smart choice, Sarah. Your father will be well taken care of, I promise." I nodded, looking defeated, while my mind raced ahead to the real plan that was already forming. Victoria thought she'd won, thought she had neutralized the threat I posed. That was exactly what I needed her to think. Because my first step wasn't going to be retreat, it was going to be the most important phone call of my life. The next morning, I told Dad I needed to return to Portland to handle some work issues that couldn't wait any longer. He was disappointed but understanding, especially when I promised to come back the following weekend. Victoria drove me to the bus station, keeping up pleasant conversation the entire way, but I could feel her satisfaction radiating from the driver's seat. She thought I'd scared me off, thought I had broken my resolve. What she didn't know was that I'd already made contact with someone who could help me, Detective Linda Ramirez of the Portland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I'd called her at 6 a.m. before Victoria was awake and explained the situation. "Sounds like we're dealing with the serial romance scammer," Detective Ramirez had said. "We see more of these cases every year. The good news is if you're willing to work with us, we might be able to build a case that protects your father and puts this woman away for a long time. What do you need from me?" "Evidence, lots of it.
and patience. These operations take time to build properly if we want charges that will stick. So my first step wasn't backing down, it was going undercover. Victoria thought she'd won the first round, but the fight was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't going in alone.
Working with Detective Ramirez proved to be more complicated than I'd anticipated. 2 days after returning to Portland, I sat in her cramped office at the downtown precinct, staring at a stack of legal documents that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. The problem, Detective Ramirez explained, sliding her reading glasses down her nose, is that everything Victoria has done so far exists in a legal gray area. Elder fraud is notoriously difficult to prosecute unless we can prove intent to defraud, and she's been very careful to stay within the bounds of what could be considered normal marital financial planning. But she threatened me, I protested. She admitted she's conning my father. In a private conversation, with no witnesses and no recording, Ramirez leaned back in her chair. Don't get me wrong, Sarah. I believe you completely. I've seen this exact pattern before. But believing you and being able to build a prosecutable case are two different things. I felt the familiar weight of frustration settling on my shoulders. So what do we do? We need her to incriminate herself in a way that will hold up in court, and we need to document ongoing criminal behavior, not just suspicious activity. Ramirez pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes. Tell me about her previous victims again. Have you made contact with any of them? This was where things got interesting. I'd spent my first day back in Portland tracking down Robert Chen's family and Harold Morrison's children. What I discovered had changed everything. Robert Chen's sister believes he was murdered, I said. She's been trying to get the Phoenix Police Department to reopen the case for 2 years. Ramirez looked up sharply. Murdered? How? Chen had no history of heart problems. He was in excellent health, exercised regularly, had just passed a complete physical 2 months before he died. But the autopsy showed signs of digitalis poisoning, something that mimics heart attack symptoms but is almost impossible to detect unless you're specifically looking for it. And they didn't investigate further? The medical examiner ruled it natural causes because digitalis can occur naturally in the body under certain circumstances. Chen's sister hired a private investigator, but without the police department's cooperation, they couldn't get access to evidence. Ramirez is writing furiously now. What about Morrison? That's even worse. His son Marcus has been trying to file criminal charges for 3 years. Apparently, Victoria convinced Harold to undergo an experimental treatment for early-stage dementia. The treatment was administered by a clinic that turned out to be unlicensed. The drugs they gave him accelerated his cognitive decline and made him completely dependent on Victoria within months. Jesus, where's this clinic now? Closed down 6 months after Harold's treatment ended. The doctor who ran it disappeared, but Marcus Morrison thinks Victoria was involved in setting it up. Detective Ramirez set down her pen and looked at me seriously. Sarah, if what you're telling me is accurate, we're not dealing with simple elder fraud. We're potentially looking at a serial killer who's been operating for years. The words hit me like a physical blow. Serial killer. I thought about Dad, about his heart attack, and about how quickly Victoria had pushed for medical decisions and insurance changes. What's our next step? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to coordinate with the other jurisdictions and build a multi-state case. But more immediately, we need to protect your father while gathering evidence. Are you willing to go back to Millbrook and work undercover? I nodded without hesitation, though my stomach was churning with fear. Here's what we're going to do, Ramirez said, pulling out a small device that looked like a hearing aid. You're going to wear a wire. We need Victoria to incriminate herself on tape, preferably discussing her plans for your father or her previous crimes. Going back to Millbrook 3 days later felt like walking into a trap. I'd called Dad and told him I'd finished my work early and wanted to spend more time helping with his recovery. He had sounded genuinely happy to hear from me, which made the deception even harder. Victoria, on the other hand, greeted my return with barely concealed suspicion. Back so soon? She said, her smile not reaching her eyes. I thought you said you had important work to handle. I did, but I realized nothing's more important than family, I replied, the wire feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds against my chest. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Victoria watched my every move, clearly trying to determine whether I was a genuine threat or if her intimidation had worked. Meanwhile, I had to act naturally around Dad while secretly recording conversations and documenting Victoria's behavior. The breakthrough came on my 4th night back. Dad had gone to bed early after a particularly exhausting day of physical therapy, and Victoria suggested we have a glass of wine on the back porch. "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable," she said, settling into one of the wicker chairs. "Your father has been so much happier with you here."
"I just want what's best for him," I replied, accepting the wine and hoping my nervousness didn't show. "Of course you do. You're a good daughter." Victoria took a sip of her wine and gazed out at the lake. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about my previous marriages." My pulse quickened. "What about them?" "I wasn't entirely honest with you. The truth is, I've learned to be very strategic about my relationships." Victoria's voice was casual, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "Men like your father, they need to feel needed. They want to take care of someone, to feel like they're making a difference." "That sounds healthy," I said carefully. Victoria laughed softly. "Healthy for me, certainly. Do you know what Robert Chen's last words were?" The question caught me completely off guard. No. "He said, 'Thank you for making me feel alive again.' Sweet, don't you think? He was so grateful for our time together, even as the digitalis was stopping his heart." My blood turned to ice. She'd just confessed to murder and the wire was recording every word. "Digitalis?" I managed to ask. "From the foxglove plants in his garden. Beautiful flowers, but incredibly toxic. A few dried leaves ground up and mixed into his morning smoothie for a week, and voila, a completely natural-looking heart attack." Victoria turned to look at me directly. "The beauty of it is that digitalis occurs naturally in the human body under stress. Unless someone is specifically looking for poison, it just looks like cardiac failure." I forced myself to take a sip of wine, fighting to keep my expression neutral. "That's clever?" "I thought so." Harold was more challenging. His children were suspicious from the beginning. But the beauty of experimental medical treatments is that no one questions side effects when they're clearly explained as possibilities. "What kind of side effects?" "Rapid cognitive decline, increased dependency, paranoia about family members." Victoria smiled at the memory. By the time Harold was completely incapacitated, his children looked like the bad guys for questioning his treatment choices, and I looked like the devoted wife trying to help her husband through a difficult illness. She was confessing to everything, 2 murders and systematic elder abuse. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt sick. This woman was sitting in my mother's chair, drinking wine in my childhood home, casually discussing how she'd killed 2 people. "What about my father?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Victoria's expression grew thoughtful. "Your father is different, stronger. The heart attack was unfortunate timing. I hadn't planned for that complication so early in the relationship. But it's worked out well, actually. Medical emergencies make people more willing to make quick financial decisions." "Are you planning to hurt him?" "Hurt him? Sarah, I would never hurt your father unnecessarily. He's going to live a long, happy life with me. He'll just gradually become more financially dependent, and when the time is right, he'll update his will to reflect our marital status. Perfectly legal, perfectly normal." "And if he doesn't want to change his will?" "Then he'll develop the same heart condition that took Robert Chen. Medical history is so important for these things. Your father's recent cardiac event makes him a very plausible candidate for another episode." I had to get out of there. The recording was more than enough for Detective Ramirez, but I needed to maintain my cover until the police could move. "I should check on Dad," I said, standing up. "Of course. Give him my love." Victoria raised her wine glass in a mock toast. "To family."
That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and processing what had just happened. Victoria had confessed to murdering 2 people and was planning to kill my father if he didn't cooperate with her financial schemes. The evidence was damning, but I was still trapped in the house with a serial killer who thought I was her ally. The next morning brought a new complication that made everything infinitely more dangerous. I woke up to find Victoria in the kitchen tucking quietly on the phone. Yes, she's here now. I think she knows more than she's letting on. Might need to accelerate the timeline. When she saw me, Victoria ended the call quickly and smiled brightly. "Good morning, honey. I was just talking to your father's cardiologist about scheduling his next appointment." But I'd recognized enough of the conversation to know she wasn't talking to any doctor. Victoria was coordinating with someone else, possibly other members of whatever criminal organization she was part of. The stakes had just gotten higher, and I was running out of time. Dad's life depended on me getting this evidence to Detective Ramirez without alerting Victoria to what I'd discovered. But first, I had to survive another day in the house with a woman who just admitted she was prepared to kill again.
The plan fell apart at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when Dad woke up screaming. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering as Dad's voice echoed through the house, a sound of pure agony that cut through the night silence like a blade. By the time I reached his bedroom, Victoria was already there, cradling his head while he writhed in obvious pain. "Call 911, she shouted when she saw me. "I think he's having another heart attack." But as I fumbled for my phone, something made me pause. Dad's symptoms weren't quite right. His breathing was labored, yes, but his color was wrong, a grayish pallor I'd never seen before. And his pupils were dilated, unfocused in a way that seemed neurological rather than cardiac. "Sarah, call the ambulance." Victoria's voice was sharp with what sounded like genuine panic. I dialed 911, but as I spoke to the dispatcher, my mind was racing. The timing was too convenient. I'd gathered damning evidence against Victoria just hours ago, and now Dad was having a medical emergency that would likely result in hospitalization, removing him from my protection, and giving Victoria time to disappear. The paramedics arrived within minutes, efficient and professional, as they worked to stabilize Dad. But as they prepared to transport him, one of them pulled me aside. "Ma'am, I need to ask, has your father ingested anything unusual tonight? His symptoms are presenting as possible poisoning rather than cardiac distress." The words hit me like a physical blow. Poisoning. Victoria was making her move. "What kind of poisoning?" I whispered. "Could be several things. We'll know more once we get blood work at the hospital." The paramedic's expression was grim. "But his heart rhythm is irregular in a way that suggests a toxic substance rather than natural cardiac failure." As the ambulance pulled away with Dad inside, Victoria turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand what's happening," she sobbed. "He was fine when we went to bed. He took his medication, ate a light snack." The snack. My blood ran cold as I remembered Victoria bringing Dad a cup of herbal tea and some crackers around 10 p.m., insisting it would help him sleep better. What was in the tea? "Just chamomile, his usual bedtime blend." Victoria's performance was flawless, the concerned wife devastated by her husband's sudden illness. But I'd heard her confession. I knew what she was capable of. And now Dad was fighting for his life because I'd waited too long to act. At the hospital, Dr. Peterson confirmed my worst fears. "Your father has been poisoned with what appears to be a cardiac glycoside, possibly digitalis or some other compound. We're doing everything we can to counteract the effects, but the next 12 hours will be critical." Victoria maintained her act perfectly, playing the devastated wife, while I struggled to appear supportive rather than accusatory. But when she stepped out to make some phone calls, I cornered Dr. Peterson. "Doctor, I need to tell you something. I think my stepmother poisoned my father deliberately." Dr. Peterson's expression shifted from professional sympathy to sharp attention. "That's a very serious accusation. What makes you think that?" I explained about Victoria's criminal history, about the wire recording, about her previous victims. Dr. Peterson listened with growing alarm, then excused herself to speak with hospital security and the police. Within an hour, Detective Ramirez arrived with 2 other officers, but when they approached Victoria in the waiting room, she was ready for them. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she said, fresh tears appearing on cue. "I think Sarah might be having some kind of breakdown. She's been acting very strangely since she came back from Portland, and now she's making wild accusations about me trying to hurt her father. That's not true, I protested, but even to my own ears, I sounded desperate and unhinged. Detective Ramirez shot me a warning look, then turned back to Victoria. Ma'am, we'd like to ask you some questions about your husband's condition, Detective Ramirez said carefully. Of course, anything to help. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. But I'm worried about Sarah. She's been under tremendous stress with her father's illness, and I think she's looking for someone to blame. That's not true, I protested, but even to my own ears, I sounded desperate and unhinged. Detective Ramirez shot me a warning look, then turned back to Victoria. We understand you prepared your husband's bedtime snack last night. Can you tell us what that consisted of? Just chamomile tea and some crackers. Tom has trouble sleeping since his surgery, so I always make him a little something to help him relax. The tea bags are still in the kitchen if you'd like to test them. Of course they were. Victoria was too smart to leave evidence lying around. Whatever she'd used to poison Dad wouldn't be found in any obvious place. The interrogation continued for 2 hours, with Victoria skillfully deflecting every question while subtly undermining my credibility. She mentioned my obsession with her previous marriages, my paranoid behavior since returning from Portland, my history of anxiety that Dad had supposedly confided to her. By the time they finished, the police looked at me with barely concealed skepticism. Detective Ramirez pulled me aside afterward, her expression grim. Sarah, I believe you, but she's good. Really good. And without the recording device, which mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial conversation, we don't have enough evidence to hold her. What do you mean it malfunctioned? The wire picked up everything except the confession. There's some kind of electronic interference right during the time she was talking about the murders, almost like she knew about the device and had something to block it. My legs nearly gave out. Victoria had known about the wire all along. She'd been playing with me, feeding me just enough information to make me feel like I was winning while she planned her endgame. She's going to disappear, I said, panic rising in my throat. As soon as she's sure Dad is going to die, she'll vanish with whatever money she's already stolen. We're watching her, Detective Ramirez assured me. But unless your father recovers enough to testify about what happened, or we find physical evidence of the poisoning, our hands are tied. That night, I sat beside Dad's hospital bed, watching the machines that were keeping him alive and trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. The doctors had managed to stabilize his condition, but he remained unconscious, his body fighting the effects of whatever Victoria had given him. Around midnight, Victoria appeared in the doorway. She'd changed from her concerned wife outfit into something more business casual, and she was carrying a small overnight bag. I thought you might want some time alone with him, she said softly. I'm going to go home and get some rest. But I knew she wasn't going home. This was goodbye. Victoria was cutting her losses and running, leaving Dad to die while she disappeared with whatever she'd already managed to steal. Victoria, wait, I said, standing up. I need to know, why my father? Out of all the men you could have targeted, why him? She paused in the doorway, considering whether to answer. Finally, she smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her. Because he was perfect, she said simply. Wealthy, but not flashy. Lonely, but not desperate. Smart enough to be interesting, but trusting enough to be manipulated. And most importantly, he had a daughter who lived far away and visited infrequently. You were supposed to be a non-factor, Sarah. Your father described you as focused on your career, not interested in family drama. But I came back. Yes, you did. And you turned out to be much more perceptive than anyone anticipated. Victoria adjusted her purse strap. For what it's worth, I am sorry about your father. He really is a good man. If you hadn't interfered, he could have lived several more happy years. Before you killed him anyway. Eventually, yes, but he would have been content until the end. Now, she gestured toward Dad's still form, this is messier than I prefer. With that, Victoria walked away, leaving me alone with my dying father and the crushing weight of my failure. I'd discovered her plan, gathered evidence, worked with the police, and none of it had mattered. Dad was dying, Victoria was going to escape justice, and I was powerless to stop any of it.
The crisis point wasn't just Dad's poisoning. It was the complete collapse of everything I'd worked for. Victoria had outplayed me at every turn, and now the man I'd been trying to protect was paying the price for my mistakes. As I sat there in the sterile hospital room, listening to the steady beep of Dad's monitor ring, I realized that sometimes the greatest failures come not from lack of effort, but from underestimating the enemy you're fighting. Victoria wasn't just a con artist. She was a master manipulator who'd been perfecting her craft for years. And I'd walked into her web like an amateur, thinking I could outmaneuver someone who'd already thought 10 steps ahead. But as the hours ticked by and I watched Dad fight for his life, something began to crystallize in my mind. Victoria had made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that her victory meant my defeat. She was about to learn how wrong she was.
The breakthrough came at 6:23 a.m., when Dad's eyes fluttered open and the first word he whispered was foxglove. I'd been dozing in the hospital chair when the change in his breathing pattern woke me. His heart monitor showed a stronger, more regular rhythm, and when I leaned over his bed, his eyes were clear and focused for the first time in 18 hours. "Dad," I whispered, afraid to hope. "Sarah." His voice was barely audible, but it was him, really him. The tea. Victoria put something in the tea. "I know, Dad, I know everything. Just rest." "No." He gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me. She thinks I was unconscious, but I heard her on the phone. She's not working alone." My pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" "She called someone named Marcus, said the timeline was accelerated, that they needed to execute the transfer protocol immediately." Dad's eyes were intense despite his weakness. "Sarah, there are others, other men like me. This is bigger than just Victoria." Before I could respond, Dr. Peterson appeared with a team of nurses. Dad's sudden improvement was medically significant, and they needed to run tests to understand his recovery. But as they worked, I processed what he'd told me. Marcus. Victoria had mentioned that name before. Harold Morrison's son, who'd been trying to prosecute her for elder abuse. But if Dad was right, Marcus wasn't Victoria's victim's son, he was her partner. I stepped into the hallway and called Detective Ramirez, my hands shaking as I dialed. "Detective, my father's awake, and he overheard something that changes everything." 20 minutes later, Ramirez arrived with Agent Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force. Dad was stronger by then, able to speak in full sentences and provide details about what he overheard. She said something about the Portland operation and the Seattle acquisition. It sounded like they have multiple cons running simultaneously across different states. Agent Walsh leaned forward intently. "Mr. Mitchell, this is crucial. Did you hear any specific names or locations?" "He mentioned a David Chen, said his transfer was complete and they were ready to move to liquidation phase, and someone named William Torres in Sacramento who was approaching readiness." My blood ran cold. David Chen? That has to be related to Robert Chen, one of Victoria's previous victims. "His brother," Agent Walsh confirmed grimly. "We've been tracking this organization for 2 years. They target elderly widowers with significant assets, but they also recruit family members of previous victims. They promise a cut of the profits in exchange for insider information and assistance with the cons." The scope of what we were dealing with began to crystallize. This wasn't just Victoria operating alone. It was a sophisticated criminal network that had been systematically targeting vulnerable seniors across multiple states. "Agent Walsh, if this is a multi-state operation, do you have enough evidence to arrest Victoria now?" "Not yet, but your father's testimony, combined with what you've discovered, gives us probable cause for a federal investigation. We can get warrants, tap phones, and coordinate with other jurisdictions." "How long would that take?" "Weeks, maybe months, to build a solid case." "We don't have weeks," I interrupted. "Victoria left the hospital last night. For all we know, she's already halfway across the country." Agent Walsh exchanged a look with Detective Ramirez. "Actually, she's not. We've been monitoring her movements since yesterday. She drove to a storage facility outside Millbrook around 2 a.m. and hasn't left." "A storage facility?"
Unit 247 at Millbrook Self-Storage, rented under the name Patricia Blackwell, close enough to her current alias to be memorable, different enough to avoid immediate detection. I felt a spark of hope for the first time in hours. What's she doing there? That's what we need to find out. And that's where you come in, Sarah. Detective Ramirez pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. Victoria sent this to my father's phone an hour ago. The message read, "Tom, so sorry I had to leave suddenly. Family emergency in Chicago. We'll call later today to check on you. Love. V." She doesn't know he's awake, I realized. She thinks he's still unconscious. Exactly, which means she doesn't know he overheard her phone calls. Agent Walsh looked at me seriously. "Sarah, we need you to respond to that text as if you're your father. We need to draw her out, get her talking, maybe convince her to meet somewhere we can record the conversation."
What do you want me to say? Detective Ramirez had already thought this through. Tell her the doctors are optimistic about his recovery, that you're grateful for everything she's done, and that you want to see her as soon as possible. Make it emotional, vulnerable. These types of predators can't resist the opportunity to twist the knife a little deeper. I took Dad's phone with trembling fingers and composed the message. "Victoria, thank God you're safe. Doctors say I'm improving. Sarah's been wonderful, but I need you here. When can you come back? I love you. Tom." The response came within minutes. "Oh, Tom, I'm so relieved. I should be back tonight. There are some things we need to discuss about our future. Rest now. V." "She's taking the bait," Agent Walsh said with satisfaction. "Now we set the trap." The plan they outlined was risky but elegant. Dad would be moved to a private room that could be monitored and recorded. When Victoria arrived, I would be hidden nearby with a backup recording device while law enforcement positioned themselves throughout the hospital. The goal was to get Victoria to incriminate herself while thinking she was in complete control. But first, we needed to understand what was in that storage unit. Agent Walsh obtained a warrant within hours, the kind of rapid response that only happens when federal agencies coordinate properly. At 2 p.m., I found myself in an unmarked van outside Millbrook's self-storage, watching through surveillance equipment as agents prepared to search Unit 247. What they found inside was staggering. The storage unit was set up like a command center for a criminal enterprise. There were filing cabinets full of documents on dozens of potential victims, complete with financial profiles, psychological assessments, and family relationship analyses. One entire wall was covered with a timeline showing active operations across 7 states, with Victoria's initials next to 12 completed acquisitions totaling over $8 million. But the most damning evidence was a detailed manual titled Senior Romance Acquisition Protocol, a step-by-step guide to identifying, targeting, and systematically defrauding elderly victims. The manual included specific instructions for everything from creating false identities to accelerating medical emergencies when targets became suspicious. Jesus, Detective Ramirez breathed as she flipped through the pages. This is a complete blueprint for elder abuse. They've industrialized romance scamming. Agent Walsh was photographing everything when she called out from the back of the unit. "Sarah, you need to see this." She was holding a folder labeled Mitchell, Thomas, Active. Inside were dozens of photographs of our house, detailed financial records that Victoria shouldn't have had access to, and a timeline of Dad's relationship with my mother, including the date of her death and assessment of his emotional vulnerability index. But what made my hands shake was the final document in the folder, a death certificate template with Dad's name already filled in, dated 3 days from now. Cause of death? Cardiac failure secondary to previous myocardial infarction. Victoria had been planning to kill my father from the very beginning. The only question was timing. "We have enough," Agent Walsh said grimly. "This is federal racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of elder fraud across state lines. Victoria Blackwood is going away for the rest of her life." "But we still need to catch her," I pointed out. "All of this evidence is circumstantial unless we can tie her directly to the organization and get her to admit her involvement." "That's where tonight comes in," Detective Ramirez said. "When Victoria shows up at the hospital, she's going to think she's coming to comfort a grieving stepdaughter and check on a dying husband.
Instead, she's walking into the most important conversation of her criminal career. As we drove back to the hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: genuine hope. Not just hope that Dad would survive, but hope that Victoria would finally face justice for everything she had done. The evidence was overwhelming. The trap was set. All that remained was for Victoria to step into it. But as I learned over the past weeks, Victoria Blackwood was full of surprises, and something told me that our final confrontation was going to test everything I'd learned about fighting for the people you love. The breakthrough hadn't just been Dad's recovery or the discovery of the storage unit. It was the realization that sometimes the biggest victories come from understanding that you're not fighting alone. Victoria's greatest strength had been her ability to isolate her victims and make them feel helpless. Now, for the first time, she was the one walking into a situation where she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Tonight would determine whether justice was just a concept or something worth risking everything to achieve. Victoria arrived at the hospital at exactly 7:30 p.m., carrying a bouquet of white lilies and wearing the perfect expression of concerned devotion. I watched from the hidden observation room as she walked down the corridor, completely unaware that every step was being recorded by federal agents. She paused outside Dad's room, taking a moment to compose herself, then knocked softly before entering. Through the surveillance feed, I could see Dad lying in bed, looking weak but alert. He'd insisted on being awake for this confrontation, despite the doctor's concerns. "Tom, darling," Victoria said, rushing to his bedside. "I'm so sorry I had to leave. My sister in Chicago." "There is no sister in Chicago," Dad said quietly. Victoria froze, the flowers still in her hands. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know who you really are, Victoria. Or should I call you Patricia? Or maybe Helen Morrison, the name you used in Phoenix." For a moment, Victoria's mask slipped completely. Her caring wife expression evaporated, replaced by cold calculation as she assessed the situation. But she recovered quickly, her face shifting back to confusion and hurt. "Tom, I don't understand. Are you feeling all right? Sometimes the medications can cause confusion." "I'm not confused." Dad's voice was stronger now, filled with a quiet fury I'd rarely heard from him. "I heard your phone calls while I was in the coma. I know about Marcus Morrison. I know about the storage unit. I know about the manual." Victoria set down the flowers and stepped back from the bed. Her eyes darted to the door, calculating distances and escape routes. "I think you're having some kind of breakdown," she said carefully. "Let me call the doctor." "The only person you need to call is a lawyer, because the FBI is waiting outside that door, and they have enough evidence to put you away for multiple life sentences." Victoria's facade cracked entirely. The concerned wife disappeared, replaced by the predator I'd glimpsed that night on the porch. Her voice turned cold and sharp. "You stupid old man. Do you have any idea how this is going to end? You think the FBI can protect you? We know where you live, where your daughter works, where she shops for groceries." She leaned closer to the bed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Accidents happen all the time to people who don't cooperate." "Is that a threat?" Dad asked calmly. "It's a promise." That was the moment Agent Walsh chose to enter the room, followed by Detective Ramirez and 4 other federal agents. Victoria spun around, her face cycling through surprise, anger, and finally settling on defiant arrogance. "Victoria Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise across state lines," Agent Walsh announced, producing handcuffs. "You have nothing on me," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we have everything," Agent Walsh replied. "We have your storage unit with detailed plans for 12 murders. We have recorded confessions. We have financial records showing $8 million in stolen assets. And as of this afternoon, we have testimony from 3 other victims who survived your previous cons." Victoria's eyes widened. "Chen and Morrison are..." "Yes, dead and incapacitated. But David Chen recovered enough to give us a deposition yesterday, and Harold Morrison's medical records show clear evidence of induced cognitive decline through unauthorized pharmaceutical intervention." Agent Walsh snapped the handcuffs into place. "Your organization made one critical error. You kept too many records." As they led Victoria away, she turned back to look at Dad one final time. The expression on her face was pure hatred, all pretense abandoned. "This isn't over," she said. "You have no idea how deep this goes." "Actually, we do," Agent Walsh replied. "We arrested Marcus Morrison and 6 other members of your network this afternoon. Your entire operation is finished." The door closed behind them, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I emerged from the observation room and rushed to Dad's bedside, tears streaming down my face.
"We did it," I whispered, taking his hand. "We actually did it." "No, sweetheart," Dad said, squeezing my fingers. "You did it. You saved my life and probably the lives of countless others." Over the next several days, as the full scope of Victoria's criminal network unraveled, the magnitude of what we'd stopped became clear. The FBI discovered evidence of plans to target over 40 additional victims across the western United States. The Senior Romance Acquisition Protocol had been refined over years of successful cons, with Victoria's organization stealing an estimated $15 million from elderly victims over the past decade. But more importantly, they'd prevented at least 6 planned murders. Robert Chen's brother confirmed that Robert had been scheduled to die of natural causes within days of when it actually happened. Harold Morrison's fake medical treatment had been designed to kill him slowly while making Victoria appear to be a devoted caregiver fighting a losing battle. Dad's case had been different only because his heart attack had accelerated Victoria's timeline, forcing her to act more quickly and with less preparation than usual. That urgency had created the mistakes that allowed us to catch her. 3 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Portland, watching Victoria Blackwood accept a plea bargain that would put her in prison for life without the possibility of parole. She had aged dramatically during her time in custody, the perfectly maintained facade finally cracking to reveal the hard, calculating predator underneath. As part of her plea agreement, Victoria provided information that led to the arrest of 14 additional members of her criminal network across 7 states. The organization had been operating for over 8 years, targeting vulnerable seniors with surgical precision and stealing their life savings before disposing of them. During the sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. Standing at the podium, looking directly at the woman who tried to destroy my family, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, but profound sadness for all the lives she'd shattered. Victoria Blackwood targeted my father because she thought he was alone and vulnerable, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. She was wrong on both counts. He wasn't alone. He had a daughter who loved him enough to fight for him. And he wasn't vulnerable. He was strong enough to survive her poison and brave enough to testify against her. I paused, looking at Dad sitting in the gallery behind me, recovered now and looking healthier than he had in years. But this case isn't really about my father or my family. It's about the 12 people Victoria murdered and the dozens more she would have killed if we hadn't stopped her. It's about Harold Morrison, who will never recover from what she did to him. It's about Robert Chen, who died believing he'd found love again. It's about every elderly person who's ever been targeted by predators who see loneliness as opportunity. When I finished speaking, Victoria was staring at me with the same cold hatred I'd seen in the hospital. But it didn't frighten me anymore. She was powerless now, facing the consequences of choices she'd made over years of calculated cruelty. The judge sentenced her to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. 6 months after the trial, Dad and I were back at Lake Clearwater, working together to renovate the guest bathroom, the same project Victoria had suggested during those early days when she was still playing the role of loving wife. But now the house felt like ours again, cleansed of the darkness Victoria had brought into our lives. "You know what I learned from all this?" Dad said, pausing in his work to look out at the lake. "What's that?" "That the best inheritance I can leave you isn't this house, or my business, or any amount of money. It's the knowledge that you're strong enough to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible." I smiled, understanding finally why Dad had been so insistent on me promising to take care of the house. It wasn't about the property itself.
It was about protecting the legacy of love and integrity that had been built within these walls over 4 generations. The house will be here for your children someday, Dad continued, but more importantly, they'll know they come from a family that doesn't back down when it matters. As the sun set over the lake that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, I thought about Victoria Blackwood sitting in a federal prison cell, her carefully constructed empire of deception reduced to nothing. She'd spent years perfecting the art of exploitation, but in the end, she'd been undone by something she never understood: the power of genuine love and the strength that comes from fighting for family. The greatest gift Dad had given me wasn't his house or his money. It was the example of how to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. And maybe that's what real inheritance is. Not what someone leaves you, but what they teach you to protect for the people who come after. Victoria thought she was stealing our legacy. Instead, she'd helped us discover what it really meant. And that was something no con artist could ever take away.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.